You know what's strange about where we live? We spend more time choosing a coffee maker than we do thinking about the people we'll be living next to for years, maybe decades. We look at the house, the yard, the kitchen counters. We measure the closets. We check the water pressure. But the neighbors? We wave, we smile, we assume it'll be fine. And then one day, 6 months in, you're standing in your own driveway feeling like a prisoner. And you can't quite figure out when your home stopped feeling like a sanctuary and started feeling like a stage where you're constantly performing for an audience you never auditioned for. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you felt truly at peace in your own space? Not just inside your house, but outside it. In your yard, on your street, that feeling of being able to breathe without wondering who's watching, who's judging, who's about to knock on your door with another problem that somehow becomes yours. Most people don't realize how much their neighbors affect their life until it's too late. Until they're locked into a mortgage, trapped next to people who are slowly draining the joy out of the one place that's supposed to be their refuge. So let me tell you about 6 types of neighbors you should avoid. Not because I want you to be paranoid or antisocial, but because I've learned something over the years. Something I wish someone had told me earlier. Your home is not just a building. It's the container for your life. And the people around that container, they seep in. Whether you want them to or not. Here's what nobody wants to admit. Some people don't see property lines. They don't see fences. They don't see closed doors or no soliciting signs or any of the normal signals that say, this is my space, not yours. They see opportunity. I'm going to tell you something I've never said out loud. I once lived next to a man named Richard. Nice enough guy on the surface, always smiling, always friendly. And for the first month, I thought I'd gotten lucky. Good neighbor, I told myself. The kind who waves, who asks how you're doing, who seems genuinely interested. But then it started. First, it was borrowing tools. A screwdriver, a ladder, just for an hour, he'd say. And I'd say yes because, well, that's what neighbors do, right? They help each other. Then it was walking through my yard as a shortcut to his garage. Hope you don't mind, he'd call out, already halfway across my lawn. And I didn't say anything because I didn't want to seem petty. It's just grass, I told myself. Then one Saturday morning, I woke up to find him in my backyard. Not knocking on my door, not asking permission, just there. Trimming a branch from my tree that was, according to him, hanging over into his view. And you see, here's what I realized too late. Richard didn't have bad intentions. He genuinely didn't understand that he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, being neighborly meant having access. Being friendly meant there were no real boundaries between us. But boundaries aren't walls you build to keep people out. They're the space you need to remain yourself. And when someone doesn't respect them, when they treat your property, your time, your privacy as communal resources they can access whenever they feel like it, something inside you starts to shrink. You become smaller in your own space. You start checking before you go outside. You stop using your own yard because you don't want the interaction. You feel guilty for wanting privacy in your own home. It's a kind of spiritual exhaustion, this constant vigilance in the one place you're supposed to rest. The person who violates boundaries is dangerous because they make you feel like you're the problem, like you're being unreasonable for wanting basic respect. And every time you don't speak up, every time you let it slide, the boundary moves a little further into your territory, until there's almost nothing left that's truly yours. Then there are the neighbors who live in permanent chaos, and they need you to know about it, constantly. Their car breaks down, their pipes burst, their relationships explode, their family member is in the hospital, their job is in jeopardy, and somehow, mysteriously, they need something from you every single time. Now watch what happens when you help them once. You jump their car, you loan them money, you let them use your Wi-Fi while theirs is being fixed. You become part of their crisis management system. And the crises never stop. They just rotate. I knew a woman once. Let's call her Michelle. She lived 2 doors down. And I'll tell you, she was the most exhausting person I've ever lived near. Not because she was mean, but because her life was a perpetual emergency that required an audience. Every conversation started with a problem. Every wave from across the street came with a story about something going wrong. And here's the thing, at first, you want to help. You think she's going through a hard time. This is temporary. But it's never temporary. 3 months in, you realize the hard time is her identity. The chaos is how she connects. And you're not her neighbor anymore. You're her support system, her therapist, her emergency contact, her solution. And the moment you try to step back, the moment you say you can't help this time, you become the villain in her story. You're the selfish neighbor who doesn't care, who turned their back when she needed someone most. The person who generates crisis after crisis doesn't want solutions. They want attention. They want to be rescued. They want to know someone is watching, caring, staying involved. And if you don't protect yourself, you'll find that their chaos becomes your chaos. Their stress becomes your stress. Their inability to handle their own life becomes your responsibility. It's a kind of mental exhaustion that's hard to describe. You start dreading simple things, getting your mail, taking out the trash. Anything that might trigger another encounter, another emergency, another request that you don't have the energy to fulfill but feel too guilty to refuse. Can I be honest with you about something? There's a type of neighbor who made me understand what it feels like to be slowly suffocated by someone else's attention. They notice things. They keep an eye on the neighborhood. They watch out for suspicious activity. At first, this seems helpful, vigilant even. But then you realize they're watching everything, and they're keeping score. They know what time you leave for work, what time you come home, who visits you and how often, when you put your trash out, when you mow your lawn, what you're wearing, what you're carrying, where you're going. And they mention it, casually. Oh, I noticed you got home late last night. Saw you had company this weekend. Haven't seen you leave for your morning walk in a few days. Everything okay? There was a woman who lived across from me once. Carol, retired, sweet, always at her window. And at first, I thought it was nice. She waved, she smiled. She seemed to care about the neighborhood. But then I noticed I was changing my behavior. I was timing when I left the house. I was avoiding certain activities in my yard because I knew she was watching. I stopped having friends over as much because I didn't want to answer questions about who they were. I felt like I was living in a fishbowl. And the worst part? She thought she was being friendly. She thought her constant observation was neighborly concern. But surveillance, even well-intentioned surveillance, is control. It's a way of saying, I have the right to monitor your life. And when you live under constant observation, you stop being yourself. You start performing. You edit your own life to avoid someone else's commentary. This affects you spiritually in ways that are hard to name. You can't settle. You can't truly be at home because home requires privacy. It requires the freedom to be unseen, unmonitored, unjudged. When someone is always watching, you lose access to the parts of yourself that only emerge in solitude. Then there are the neighbors who treat the street like a battlefield. Everything is a threat to their domain. You park too close to their driveway, they leave a note. Your tree drops leaves in their yard, they're at your door. Your guests block their view for 30 seconds, they're calling the HOA. Everything is a violation. Everything is an encroachment. Everything requires confrontation. Let me tell you what this does to you. It makes you afraid in your own neighborhood. You start avoiding your own street. You park 3 blocks away to avoid conflict. You apologize for existing. You live in a constant state of low-grade anxiety, wondering what you'll be accused of next. I once watched a man spend 3 years at war with his neighbor over 6 inches of property line. 6 inches. They surveyed. They lawyered up. They stopped speaking. They glared at each other every morning. All over 6 inches of grass that neither of them even used. And you see, it wasn't really about the property. It was about power. It was about dominance. It was about making sure the other person knew who was in control. The neighbor who turns everything into conflict doesn't want resolution. They want submission. They want you to acknowledge their supremacy. And no matter how much you accommodate, it will never be enough. because the conflict is the point. Living next to someone like this creates a specific kind of mental exhaustion. It's the tiredness that comes from being in a war you never enlisted in, from defending yourself against accusations you don't deserve, from spending energy on problems that shouldn't exist. Here's something else. There are neighbors who genuinely don't believe noise is a problem. Or if they do, they believe their right to make noise supersedes your right to peace. They mow at 7 in the morning. They blast music at midnight. They rev their motorcycle. They let their dog bark for hours. They have loud parties on weeknights. And when you politely mention it, they look at you like you're insane. It's only 11 p.m. I'm allowed to use my property. If you don't like noise, move to the country. Here's what nobody tells you about living next to someone like this. It's not just about the noise. It's about the message underneath the noise, which is, I don't care about your comfort. I don't care about your sleep. I don't care about your peace. My wants matter more than your needs. And you know what's interesting? These neighbors often consider themselves free spirits, someone who doesn't live by society's arbitrary rules, someone who's just living their life. But freedom that tramples someone else's peace isn't freedom. It's dominance, wearing a casual smile. I'm going to tell you something that might make me sound petty. I once lived below a couple who walked like they were trying to break through to the foundation. Every step was a thunderclap. Every dropped item was an event. Every furniture-moving session happened at 2 a.m. And when I finally, after months of not sleeping, went upstairs to ask if they could possibly be a little quieter at night, do you know what they said? We're just living our lives. As if I wasn't. As if my need for sleep was unreasonable. As if sharing space meant they had no obligation to consider anyone but themselves. That's when I understood. Some people don't lack awareness. They lack care. And there's no reasoning with someone who fundamentally doesn't believe your comfort matters. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. And living next to someone who steals your rest steals something deeper, your ability to recover, to think clearly, to feel like yourself. It's a spiritual erosion that happens night after night until you're just a shell going through the motions. But perhaps the most draining of all is the neighbor who feeds off your energy. They don't violate your physical boundaries. They don't make noise. They don't surveil you. They do something more insidious. Every interaction leaves you exhausted. They're always negative, always complaining, always finding problems. The neighborhood is going downhill. The weather is terrible. Their health is failing. The world is ending. And they want you to swim in this darkness with them. At first, you try to help. You listen, you sympathize, you offer perspective. But nothing changes. They don't want perspective. They want someone to agree that everything is as hopeless as they believe it is. I knew someone like this. David. Every conversation was quicksand. You'd walk over to check your mail. He'd catch you. And 45 minutes later, you'd be standing there, trapped, listening to his list of grievances against existence itself. And here's what made it so hard. He was lonely. I could see that. He needed connection. And part of me felt guilty for wanting to avoid him. But you see, there's a difference between someone who's struggling and someone who's made suffering their hobby. The person who's struggling wants to feel better. The person who feeds on negativity wants company in their misery. And if you stay too long, if you don't protect your own energy, you'll start to see the world through their lens. Everything will start to feel heavy. You'll catch their despair like a cold. And before you know it, you're dreading coming home because you know they'll be there, waiting, ready to pull you down into their pit. This is mental exhaustion of the deepest kind, not from doing too much, but from carrying someone else's darkness without consent. From being their emotional landfill, from having your own light dimmed every single day. And then, this might be the most unsettling of all, there are the neighbors who smile at you but don't like you. You can feel it. Something in their eyes doesn't match their mouth. Something in their energy contradicts their words. They wave, they make small talk, they say all the right things, but underneath there's judgment, there's resentment, there's something cold and false. Maybe it's the way they live. Maybe it's how you look. Maybe it's something you said once that they never forgot. Maybe it's nothing you did at all. Maybe they just decided you're not their kind of people, and you can't quite put your finger on it, but you know, you feel it in your body. That tightness in your chest when you see them. That feeling of being evaluated. That sense that every interaction is a performance they're enduring rather than enjoying. Here's what this does to you spiritually. It makes you doubt yourself. You start wondering if you're imagining it, if you're being paranoid, if you're the problem, because they're so nice on the surface, so correct in their behavior. But your body knows, your intuition knows. And living next to someone who smiles while disliking you is a special kind of poison. It's the falseness of it, the pretense, the knowing that there's no real connection, just a shared commitment to maintaining appearances. You can't relax around them. You can't be genuine, because genuine requires mutual respect, and respect requires honesty, and they're offering neither, just pleasantries that feel like tiny cuts, just waves that feel like dismissals, just smiles that never reach their eyes. So what do you do with all of this? Now, you might be thinking this all sounds harsh, maybe even cruel, but let me ask you something. How much of your life are you willing to sacrifice to people who drain it? Your home is supposed to be your sanctuary, the place where you can finally stop performing, stop managing, stop accommodating everyone else's needs. But it can't be that if you're surrounded by people who turn your sanctuary into a stage, a crisis center, a surveillance state, a battlefield, or a therapy session you never signed up for. I'm not saying you should be cold. I'm not saying you shouldn't help when genuine need arises. But there's a difference between being a good neighbor and being someone's solution to problems they won't solve themselves. When you're looking at a place to live, pay attention. Talk to the neighbors. Watch how they interact. Notice who respects boundaries and who doesn't. Notice who seems content and who seems to need chaos. Notice who looks at you with warmth and who looks at you with something else. Because here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. You can change your house. You can paint the walls, renovate the kitchen, landscape the yard, but you can't change your neighbors. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is choose carefully who you'll be living next to. Before you're trapped, before the mortgage is signed, before your sanctuary becomes a prison. Not tomorrow, not when the perfect house appears. Now, right now, as you're looking, as you're deciding, pay attention to the people, not just the property, because walls and roofs are just materials. But peace is precious, and it's worth protecting.